In this section of the course, we're going to kick off by looking at simple motion effects, by which we mean freeze frames and, well, slow-mos if you like. Of course, they could be fast mos or reverse mos or whatever. So let's go straight to it and talk first about freezing frames. If I go to the Rock Climber clips bin, and I'll just pick a clip that I'd like to freeze a frame in. So I've got, I'll take one of these shots here someplace and freeze a frame on this. Maybe that frame there. So starting from a source clip, I can simply park on a frame, and then under a right click on the monitor, I can choose freeze frame. Or you can get to the same thing actually from the composer menu, I think, freeze frame. And you can see that Avid's going to ask me what duration I want this freeze frame to last for. Because when you make a freeze frame like this in a source clip, it's rendering an actual new asset. It's creating a clip of the freeze frame. So clearly don't make a minute's worth, you use a minute's worth of disk space. Well, don't make a minute's worth unless you need a minute's worth of freeze. Also, when you make a freeze frame, you need to figure out potentially whether it's okay to use both fields of the media, or whether you need to de-interlace the clip and just freeze one field. Now this, at first glance, could only be relevant if the media itself is interlaced. But actually, in the world of Media Composer, even if you're working in a progressive scan project, it still treats the media as though it contains fields. It still processes by splitting any frame into two pseudo fields. So when you make a freeze frame, even in a progressive project, the correct choice in here would be use both fields. So that the freeze frame is at full resolution. If you pick this one using interpolated field, it will de-interlace this and average the lines of the frame together in some fashion, and you'll get reduced quality from your freeze. So this is indeed progressive media. How do I know? Well, I guess I do know that my project itself, if I go and look in settings, at the format of the project, I can see that the format of the project is 720p at 23976 frames per second. So the project itself is set up to be a P mode project. I could also go and look at the clips that I've got, and if I go into list view and just scan across until I come to the video column, it also tells me that, yeah, these clips are 720p 23976. So this is indeed all progressive media in a progressive project. Right, so freeze that frame, Michael. Right, so right click, freeze frame. I'll just make 5 seconds worth of freeze for this using both fields. Now, if I pick that, then the dialog will close and I'll have to go back to it. But now I can say 5 seconds worth of freeze is rendering this as new media to a drive. So I'll pick my media drive as the target. And it wants to know which bin to put the resulting freeze frame clip into. Well, it wouldn't be crazy to choose the effects templates bin for something like this. So maybe I'll go there. I'll say okay. And then it'll create the freeze frame clip for me. And here it is. Okay, so that's a freeze frame that of course could be cut into the sequence or used as a graphic background or whatever. Suppose you want to freeze a frame of a clip that's already in the sequence. If I headed down, for example, I might decide to freeze the last frame of this boulder planning shot or something like that, or a frame near the end there. Now in practice, you cannot freeze a frame directly that's already in a sequence using this simple method. If I try to right click here and say freeze frame, well, it's not there, it's not an available command. So this freeze frame of source media is exactly that. It's a freeze of an original master clip. That's not to say that I can't freeze this frame, I just need a little subterfuge to do it. And that subterfuge is that I need to park on the frame I want to freeze and then match frame on it to pull the source clip back into the source monitor on the matching frame. Match frame incidentally also marks in on the matching frame. But then I can say, okay, I like to make my freeze frame. You should find that both fields is now automatically selected, as is 5 seconds. So I can just go ahead and do it straight away. There's my freeze auto-loaded to the source monitor. So I can cut that straight into the sequence. I'll just do it video only into the sequence. Clear those marks because they're not relevant. And there we are. So there's my freeze in the sequence, and you can see it's got a freeze frame icon on it to indicate that it's a freeze. Also, if you look in the bin, yeah, there's the 2 freeze frame clips that I created sitting in that bin. Okay, so now what about if rather than actually freezing a frame of video, you want to just change the speed of playback of some video? Either slow-mo or reverse or whatever. Now, there are 2 approaches to this, to be honest. You can change the speed of playback of a clip that's already in the timeline. There's a group of effects that you can use to use it that lives in the video filters, and they're called the time warp effects. Now, sadly, discussion of time warp effects is off the end of the curriculum of this course, but these are extremely flexible speed effects. They can be keyframed, you can do speed ramps, you can do all sorts of interesting things with these. But they're, as I say, not for this course. And what I'm going to show you is how you can create slow-mo media from a master clip. So effectively source monitor based motion effects. So if I've got a shot of Matt walking down the path here, and in fact these 2 shots are both at full speed, and then the next shot is an off speed, it's a slow shot. Suppose I wanted to try mimicking that slow motion on these. Well, I guess it would be helpful to know just how slow it is, and it's a bit hard to tell exactly, but my impression, let me just mute this audio, my impression is that it's about half speed, isn't it? It's a bit hard to tell precisely. But let's try a 50% speed reduction. So what I'll do is I'll go back to the first frame of this clip in the timeline. So I'll snap back there and I'll match frame to it to pull it back into the source monitor. Now in principle, I can now slow this clip down. It will slow down from the in mark all of the media down to the end. Now I need to be a bit careful of that because that could be a lot of media if I'm not careful. So, again, I'm not going to need that much. About 3-4 seconds worth what to do. So I'll mark a duration. And now if I make a slow-mo, it'll just freeze that into out range. This command, this is not a command that's under a right click. I actually need to go and map a button from the command palette to do this. So I'll go Tools, Command Palette, and on the Effects tab of the command palette, there's a button called the Motion Effect Editor, which I'll put on the source monitor's toolbar someplace. There we go. Now I've accidentally put that on top of Step to the Left. I'll move it across here and I'll put step to the left, or step backwards 1 frame, back into place there. Okay, so the clip's loaded, the duration I want to modify is marked. Click the motion effect editor. And up comes a dialog in which I can put a percentage speed, or if I prefer, a number of frames per second. So if I said I want to run this at 6 frames per second, it says that's 25% speed. Oh, you know, if I want to run it at 33% speed, it'll work out how many frames per second that is. So whichever way round, you can do it. But like I say, I suspect that the answer that I want is 50% speed, which of course is going to double the duration of the clip. It was 75 frames long. It's now, after processing, it'd be 150 frames long. I get a choice of how Avid stretches a clip out like that. If you're going to double the duration, you're going to need some more frames of video from somewhere. And down here it says render to field motion effect using a variety of different methods. Now, only one of these actually makes sense if you've got progressive scan media. And that really is the both fields render method. So both fields, treat each frame as an entire frame. And you know, if you want to run at half speed, just repeat the frame. These others, duplicated field, will de-interlace a piece of interlace video into 2 fields, and it'll discard the second field, and then create the motion effect using just the field 1 of each frame. That avoids conflicts of motion positions. It avoids motion fluttering from occurring in the slow-mo, but it's a very basic and crude way to create a motion effect. And a much better way, if you're using interlace video, is to use the method called interpolated field. Now we saw this available for the freeze frame as well. And what interpolated field really means is de-interlace into 2 fields, but then use both fields in the creation of the motion effect in the correct motion sequence, in the correct time order. It's actually got twice the resolution of basic duplicated field, which discards field 2 and never uses it. So interpolated, definite improvement on duplicated if you're working with interlace video. There's a curious thing at the bottom of the list called VTR style, which mimics the way that an old-fashioned videotape recorder would do slow-mo. Videotape recorders are quite good at playing alternate fields out of a clip to make a slow-mo, but field 2 is vertically displaced by 1 line relative to field 1. And so when they were playing back their slow-mo, the video would bounce vertically, it would jiggle vertically, and that's what Avid calls a VTR style slow-mo. Why you would want to make one today, I have no idea. So, like I say, if your video is progressive scan, this is the only one worth mentioning. Once again, it's going to want to store the result on a media drive because we're going to render this, and I'll make sure I pick my media drive where all the rest of my 101 class media is, and then I'll create and render. Once again, it wants to know which bin to put the resulting clip into, so I'll choose the effects templates and say OK. And off it goes and creates the motion effect. It automatically loads it into the source monitor. And there it is. But also in the bin that you specified, you know, there's the motion effect clip, and in this case it's a 12 frames per second clip. Okay, so I can put that into the sequence in place of the one that's currently there. It's that one. Hopefully it's going to be long enough. I guess that half speed would do. But I want to put it in for exactly that duration. Now, that's easy enough to do. I can simply park on this clip with the video track enabled and hit this guy, mark clip. That's going to mark from end to end of the current clip. Then I can go and overwrite this clip into place. And there it is. Yeah, it's about right. It looks like it might even be a little bit fast. Now, if I think it is actually a little bit fast, then Media Composer will not allow me to process the Slo-Mo clip for a second time. If I've got the Slo-Mo clip loaded and hit the motion effect editor button again, it says no. It says no, sorry, look, you're going to have to go back to the original and have another go from there. So I'll click on the menu and pick up the original and then go back around the loop again. And this time I guess I'll pick, I don't know, 40% speed. Once again, both fields render, media drive, create and render. Into the effects templates, okay. Mark the segment and overwrite back in place. Is that better? Well, the speed looks better, but as you can see, the slower you go, the more obviously the clip contains frame repeats. As I step through that frame by frame, yeah, because we've used this simple both fields interpolation, it is becoming quite steppy. But that's the best you can do from a source monitor based motion effect. There is no frame blending, there's no optical flowing available at source level. Not to give the game away too much, you would do this as a time warp effect because that would bring a whole range of better frame interpolation methods into play for you. Okay, now also when I made that Slo-Mo clip, there was a slight anxiety in my mind as to whether I had actually made enough to fill the segment that I was putting it into. Let me do this one as well, and let's look at how we might do this differently. So if I know that I want to put a clip in Slo-Mo into a particular duration in the timeline, I could do this. I could mark the duration in the timeline. Once again, I'll use the same clip that's already there, just in Slo-Mo instead. So once again, I'll match frame it. And I'll find the bit of the clip that I like the look of. And now I'm going to do a fit to fill edit to put that into place. Well, you probably noticed on the regular motion effect editor, there's a box that says fit to fill. And it'll work out what the speed is that you need to render the clip at to make that duration fill that duration. So that might be enough for you. You could just use regular motion effect dialog and tick fit to fill to let it work it out for you. But actually you can do better than that. Let me cancel out of there. And there's another button that you can map from the command palette that will speed this process up still more. So this time on the Edit tab, you'll find that there's an edit mode called Fit to Fill that you could map onto your source monitor toolbar. Well, we've got, splice in and override edit. I'll put Fit to Fill edit next to them there. Okay, so I'm good to go. I've got duration marked in the source, different duration marked in the sequence, and I can just say, all right, fit to fill then, please. And all it will say is which bin do you want to put the media on, and then the job is done. It renders the result and it drops it straight into the timeline for you. So there we are, simple motion effects. And as I say, I apologise for holding out on you, but that's the limitations of this particular course. Okay, now our next little topic of conversation after that is what Avid calls nesting effects. Now, what on earth are they talking about? Well, let me put together a little scenario for you. This opening shot, this interview shot here, suppose that I decide that it would be nice to put the interview into black and white or something to give it some sort of sense of style. So I could go to the effects palette, filters, and I'll go to those color correction presets. And sure enough, there's a black and white preset that lives right up at the top of the list. So I'll grab that, drop it on the clip. Happy days, the clip is now in black and white. Now, if I also decide that I want to resize the shot as well, I could head down to Image, Resize. And if I want to do a resize, I could drag that into the timeline. But notice when I do, the shot comes back to normal color. In fact, what's happened is that the resize effect has replaced the black and white color correction. So at first glance, it appears that you can only have one effect applied to a clip at a time. That's absolutely not the case. I mean, let me get rid of that one as well while I'm here and start all over. So I'm going to say, all right, color correction, black and white, on you go. Okay, resize, here it is. I'm going to hold the Alt key or the Option key as I drag this on there. Hang on to the Option key until I've let the mouse go and applied the effect. Well, now I have a black and white shot that's also got a resize on it. If I look in effects mode, yeah, I can see both effects are listed here in the effects editor. So not that I would particularly want to be tweaking a color correction in the effect editor, but you can see there's the controls that are doing this. I guess I could, if I wanted a bit more contrasty, I could up the contrast a bit on that. But also, here's the resize effect, so I can also zoom the shot and reframe it, etc. So, and in Avid's terms, what I've done there is I've nested the resize effect on top of the color correction. Now, several things about this. First of all, if in the timeline I double click on this segment, that's better, there we go. It will spring open, as it were, it will expand. And what it's really telling me is that inside this resize, there is a color correction. If I double click that, it too will expand. It'll say, well, inside me, there's just a shot. There's no effect icon displayed on this. So this is the original media to which those two effects have been applied. Avid calls this process, expanded nesting or expanding the nest of effects. And it's purely a viewing thing. It's not saying there's 3 clips there in the timeline. It's saying there's one clip with 2 effects applied to it. If I double click down on the bottom one again, then it all shuts away again and it returns back to normal. So we can apply multiple effects to a clip. Just hang on to the Alt key as you apply the next effect so that it adds itself on top of the previous instead of replacing. So let me put another one into place then. So there, I've got an effects category called Illusion Effects. We've already used the fluid morph from there, but there's also actually quite a nice film grain plugin that I might use. So I'm going to grab film grain and, well, once again, I could Alt drag it to add it on top here. But since this is already highlighted, actually, and hold the Alt key and double click will do the job as well. It'll nest itself on top of all the previous. So I can raise up the amount of graininess on the shot and choose a size for the grains. I mean, this can look crazy, but anyway, I'll make it nice and obvious. In principle, you can have up to 64 effects nested on a single clip. Quite what you do with 64 effects, I cannot imagine, but there we are. So this is what Avid calls nesting effects, building up multiple effects on a clip. Now, of course, sometimes the order in which you apply those effects, or the order in which those effects are processed, is extremely important to the outcome. Let me go to another clip someplace, and I'll build the same nest, but I'll deliberately build it in the wrong order so we can see the outcome of doing so. Let me get rid of that transition effect from there. So I've got a clean clip here. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to put film grain on there first, and apply a bunch of graininess to the shot. And then I'm going to nest a resize effect on top of that. So I'll come to the resize and I'll Alt double click and have it nest itself on top. Now, why is that the wrong order, I guess, is then the question. Well, the simple answer is that if you do it in this order, if you rescale the shot, you also rescale the grain. So the resize effect is taking the output of the film grain effect as part of its input. So imagine if you were working down a sequence and you're applying different reframings on a shot-by-shot basis, the grain would be jumping in size from shot to shot. So clearly this needs to be the other way round. I mean, in this example here, we've got the film grain sitting on top of all else. And if I'm adjusting the resize factor here, then it's resizing upstream of that film grain, and therefore the film grain is staying put. So how can I change the order of these effects here? Well, the answer is you can drag them in the effect editor. So if I want the resize upstream, I can drag it underneath film grain and it becomes upstream. There. Notice that the order that those effects appear in the effect editor is probably not what you're expecting. Looking at that effect editor, film grain at the top, resize underneath. In the world of Avid, that means that resize is processed first and film grain is processed second. So you read upwards from the bottom through the list. You could just about cope with that, I guess, if it were consistent. But in the timeline, things appear the other way around. Film grain, resize. They are nothing if not inconsistent, bless them. Now, what about if you also want to get rid of an effect from within a nest? So I've got, if I come back to the one that I built first, back here, if I park on this effects nest here and hit remove effect, what it actually removes is the topmost effect. In this case, it's the film grain. And you can now see that the topmost displayed effect is the resize. Remove that one. Yeah, I'm left with the color correction. Remove that one. And I've stripped it all the way back to the original media. So this remove effect button removes one effect at a time. And it starts at the top and works its way down into the nest. Fine, but suppose that's not what you want to do. Let me go all the way back to where I was. And let's say that I simply decide I want to get rid of the color correction from this. Well, you can't delete it in the effect editor. That simply doesn't work. If I select the color correction and hit delete, well, something happened, but it wasn't what I wanted. It didn't delete the color correction, it deleted everything else. The official way to do this is, in fact, to expand the nest in the timeline. I'll double click and expand, double click and expand. There's the color correction there. Select it in the timeline and press delete. And it'll take it away, leaving the others in place. So we add effects in the timeline. We remove effects in the timeline. We just use the effect editor for setting the parameters, and I guess for reordering as well if we want to. Now, so let me shut this nest away once again. Now, this method of working with nests, of expanding so that you can see their contents, I guess is the way that I work a lot of the time these days. And it works fine as a way of working in practice, providing you've got plenty of processing power in your computer. But if you're working with maybe a lot of complex effects or non-real-time effects or whatever, working like this can be quite taxing on the processing in your system. And an alternative to this would be to work in a mode that Avid calls stepping in or stepped in nesting. I've got this topmost effect selected here. I'm seeing in here the composite of it and all the other effects in the nest. And down at the bottom of the timeline, there's a downward facing arrow called step in. And what this does is it jumps inside that nest, like that. When I step in, I'm now looking at what's at the contents of that film grain effect, and it's this resized clip. All the rest of the timeline has vanished from view, so we've shed a whole bunch of processing by stepping in this fashion. If I step in again, I step inside this effect. And now I'm looking at the original shot to which that effect was applied. Now, in the timeline, the timecode track now says N2 on it, which means you're 2 levels down in your nest. When I step out, I come back to N1, step out again. I'm back to regular timecode. I'm back to TC1. I've arrived back at the whole timeline view. So this idea of drilling down into your nests sometimes is useful, as I say, if you're finding that processing is sluggish or difficult. But it has to be said that very often, this expanded view works pretty nicely and gives you, a simultaneous view of the effect of all of those effects on the clip. You can't nest transition effects. You can only ever have one transition effect applied to a transition. So seems to make perfect sense to me that would be the case, but I just pointed out to you, I've seen people trying to alt drag multiple transitions on top of each other. It doesn't work that way. Also, while you've got this expanded nest open, notice that you can't monitor these subtracks. You can only monitor the top level, so you can only see the entire composite of all of those effects. And that's another reason why, if you did want to see what was going on in a particular effect, you might want to step into it. So there are lots of curiosities and, frankly, anachronisms about the way that Avid's nesting system works. But in the main, it's a well thought out process that you go through with all of this. Okay, so if you've got a nest of effects like this, and maybe it won't play in real time, what do? Do you have to expand up the nest and render all the effects? Well, actually, no. You can play the whole composite if you just render the topmost item. It's a top layer render, essentially. So I can just park on that thing and say, look, I need to render this. Off to my media drive. Okay. And it'll set off and do its thing. The effect icon of the topmost effect will lose its green dot. That means it's been rendered. But any constituent parts inside have not been explicitly rendered. They've just been rendered as part of the composite of this thing. So So you've only rendered one item, but you've rendered the effect of all the other effects into that one item. So there we are. There's the logic of Avid's motion effects and freeze frames, and the logic of Avid's multiple effect system, its nesting of effects.